October, new CEO of Essendon Football Club, Andrew Thorburn, was forced to choose between his church and his job as CEO at Essendon. Mr. Thorburn is chair of City on a Hill Church, where its position on abortion and same-sex marriage was on its website. The issue has generated a lot of discussion amongst politicians, commentators, churches, and Christians across society. Some are calling it one of the biggest lines in the sand for our nation. Alan Jones said Australians are tired of sport being used for culture wars. Some are calling it low-level persecution. Low level when you consider persecution in the Middle East. Today, I want to broach some of the different perspectives of the Andrew Thorburn situation. I want to consider the ramifications for sport, jobs, parents, families, for immigration, legalities, and most of all for churches, for Christians, for you and I. James 1, chapter 1, verse 2 says, "My fellow believers, when it seems as though you are facing nothing but difficulties, see it as an invaluable opportunity to experience the greatest joy that you can. For you know that when your faith is tested, it stirs up power within you to endure all things." At a time when Christianity is being opposed like never before, Jesus, Yeshua, is our only rock. So after Karen Davis sings Yeshua, I'm going to talk with Bruce Claridge, who's well known to Life FM listeners. That's Karen Davis singing Yeshua, Yeshua, and he is our rock. So Life FM listeners, you know Bruce Claridge for his work with Sports Life, and also Holmesy, who are both with me today. So Bruce, welcome.
Thank you, Ruth. It's great to be here and catch up with Holmesy again when we get back to Sports Life at the start of the next football season, a bit before we'll be back together. But it's good to be here on some very significant issues that affect sport. Just to give a little background to everyone, us three being here is really great. A bit of a reunion, Ruth.
It is actually.
Yeah, my wife Jan was matron of honour in your wedding.
In our wedding. And Bruce was our pastor.
And I married you,
us.
that's right. Yeah, you and Laurie. And
yes.
Holmesy and I were incredible had opportunities to be an amazing singing group together, didn't we, David? That was Lamplight. So there's a real...
I played the drums.
You played the drums, and I stood in the back and looked like I could sing. Anyway, Ruth, that's a bit of background for people. While we're a bit familiar here, we know one another pretty well.
For a long time, yeah.
For a long time.
So, Bruce, as a sports chaplain, as I introduced this issue with Andrew Thorburn, it must be an excruciatingly difficult issue for you, and I realise you've got to be careful on what some of the things you want to say, but for Christians involved in sport, whether players, administrators, parents, etc., tell us some of the perspectives for you.
All right. Perhaps, Ruth, if we and the listeners understand the climate in which we're in now,
yes.
You probably remember most of the times I've seen you pastored, we're in what was called a postmodern era. Now,
yes.
In postmodernism, for those who are understanding that, basically means if I say I believe in the Bible and I believe in Jesus, guys say, good on you, Bruce, that's good you believe that.
Yep.
I believe in this, I believe in that. And everyone sort of walked away, a bit of an Aussie sort of thing. And that made evangelism very hard because absolutes were going out the window.
Yes.
If you believe it, that's fine. But of course, for us, Jesus is the way, the truth,
yes.
and the life. But so there was that. But there's been a shift, and this shift is outworking in the things we're talking about today. We live in what I would call a post-Christian, moralistic world where the whole attitude has changed. It's not like, good on you, you believe that, I believe this, let's get on with life, but don't hassle me too much. This is, you must now fit with the morality that we as a society have decided is moral. And it all comes out of a non-Christian worldview. So we find ourselves now, whether it be churches, whether it be in sporting fields, people standing up for Christ in different places, like Andrew Thorburn, who is an amazing example, which we'll talk about in detail in a moment. But to paint the big picture, it's now as if, and maybe we go back a bit further, Ruth, when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, yeah. Well, it was like, and someone put it this way, that the church to the community was like cod liver oil. It didn't like it, but it was good for you.
Yes.
And so society had this attitude, well, we don't like having around, they stop us from doing things we should do, or they make us feel guilty or whatever. But it was like cod liver oil. It was, didn't like it, but it was good for you. But then there was a massive shift in the 70s, 80s, and moved us into postmodernism. And now into post-Christian moralistic society where the morals are now decided by those who have the loudest voices.
And most money.
And we can't, and say, but you can't believe that because we now believe this. So it's a massive shift. And into that environment, we now see sport being brought into. Now, for those who don't know, my role is I look after Country Victoria for Sports Chaplaincy Australia. We put Christian chaplains in sporting clubs. Sports Chaplaincy Australia is unashamedly Christian. The clubs know that they're having a Christian person. It could be a lay person, could be a minister, could be someone who's maybe had pastoral training, maybe they haven't, but they're in there and making a great difference. We've got some great chaplains around Country Victoria. But soon as this happened, and for those who don't really understand, Andrew Thorburn was appointed CEO of the Essendon Football Club, and then it was discovered, perhaps, I don't know, when or how or what or whatever, that he was in a church that believed basically what all Christian faiths from Roman Catholic, even if you head out of the Christian faith, a good amount of what he believes in Muslim and other faiths believe that. So based on that, the Essendon Football Club decided that they would not be able to have him as CEO because not things that he'd spoken out, but things that they found in a 2013 sermon by his pastor, who said, I probably would have worded things a bit differently. But Guy Mason is a very well-respected pastor in an excellent church, and it's got Anglican roots. It's sort of like a contemporary Anglican church. So Anglicans, all of us who consider ourselves evangelical or Pentecostal, and even Roman Catholic, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne said some excellent things in support of Andrew Thorburn and what this really means. So, it's a very, very challenging thing, and perhaps we'll talk to some of the implications for chaplains in a moment, because I don't want to just talk all the time, Ruth. I can do that. But as Holmesy knows, but it's a very challenging time in the big picture of society, and now, and we're also in a place where, and we've just seen recently with Pat Cummins, who is captain of the Australian One Day and Test team. We have seen Netball Australia, our Diamonds girls, lose $15 million.
That's a huge sponsorship.
It's just messed up all of their budget probably, and grassroots netball, because somewhere way back, Gina Reinhardt, whose company was sponsoring them, her father said something which was really bad and really wrong. But one of the things we've not learned in society, I think, is forgiveness and moving on. And people love to get offended. And I'm sure you or I, all of us, and people listening, if you dug back far enough, you'd find something that offended you somewhere. I could find it easily. And and we either choose to let go and forgive, and that's such an important part of our Christian faith. So we move on to what God's got next. But as a society, we're into offence rather than forgiveness.
Absolutely. And it's really touching on, and I was going to touch on a bit later about the whole Marxist push to really come against Christianity, but I don't want to jump to that just yet.
Okay.
But coming back to the sponsorship deal that you spoke about, now I'm going to give a disclaimer. I've been an Essendon supporter all my life. I was.
I hear a few people say that.
I was. Yeah. And, I used to play cricket and umpire cricket and all the rest of it. And now when I see these things, I actually haven't watched football for years. Not just, but because of the way it's going, which, you probably don't like to hear that. But a lot of people, like that Anglican Archbishop in Melbourne, he's now resigned his membership of Essendon.
That's right.
I understand that the Australian Christian Lobby said 10,000 people have written to the Essendon Football Club concerned that Christians are not welcome. There's a saying that says, go woke, go broke. And so this is going to be very difficult for clubs, surely, that they have to decide as well where they're going to stand, as well as for Christians. We're having to make some very big decisions that we haven't had to make before.
Exactly. And just to tell you some of the ramifications, on the Wednesday, I think it was, that all this news came out about Andrew Thorburn. Then I had a meeting in Melbourne of state sports chaplaincy leadership, and we were praying for Mark Purser, who was an excellent chaplain. I've had him speak at one of the dinners I have in Bendigo. He was a chaplain at Adelaide Crows when they had a couple of major tragedies, and he's well respected as a chaplain. And at Essendon has taken over from someone who's been there for a long time, and they really have embraced Andrew. His text came back and said, Bruce, thanks for praying for me, you guys. I'm really wondering where I stand now. And he does, because if he takes the principle that the Essendon Football Club have taken with Andrew Thorburn and apply it to their chaplain, well, they will have to ask the chaplain to leave because he's a Baptist minister, and basically what we all believe about abortion, what we all believe about marriage is between a man and a woman. All churches, all Orthodox Christian teaching believes that. So anyone who has any Christian faith or belongs to a Christian church like Andrew Thorburn or a Baptist church like Mark are wondering where it goes next. I think it will slow down. I think that a lot of people like Mark, and even myself at Golden Square Netball Club, I'm the chaplain there. I think once you've built strong relationship, people know that, yes, you have these beliefs, but you're not exclusive in your care. And Mark's brilliant at that. So I'm hoping common sense prevails. But I think one of the things I just mentioned here, the statement from Bishop Michael Steed, who is the chair of the Freedom for Faith movement in Victoria, says, Australia has a long and proud tradition of respecting a diversity of points of view, especially on complex personal and moral matters. Notwithstanding deep differences, we have been able to live and work together with respect, but no longer in Victoria, it would appear. He says, Thorburn stated he was forced to resign because it became clear to me that my personal Christian faith is not tolerated or permitted in the public square, at least by some and perhaps by many.
So do players bring the issues up with you?
Players haven't. They may come in soon, but I think one of the things that it's opened up is if we look back at the time this was happening, the AFLW, the women's football, had a pride round.
That's right.
And a young Muslim footballer decided that she felt it was contrary to her faith to support that, and was quite respected by people for her stand. Now, my concern is, and that's fine, if she does that, good, and she took a stance, and people honour that. I'm wondering, Ruth, and maybe you might have some thoughts too, if a Christian footballer said, based on such as the Manly Sea Eagles, where does that go? And we seem to be in a very anti-Christian place, and we're just starting. I think the church is just starting to realise it, and to know that we are in a different climate. We're in a post-Christian, moralistic society that says you have to believe the morals that we believe, or you're a bigot, and that's very unfair. And Andrew Thorburn is just a high-level example. But in answer to your question, I don't know. I'm wondering. The Manly Sea Eagles one was a great example. And I think those boys they spoke to their parents. They're from Islander backgrounds, very strong cultural, as well as strong Christian belief. And their parents said they'd stand with them, go with your heart. They went with their heart, and I admire them very much. But
because it raises the issue of Israel Folau some years ago,
right.
we've got the same thing happening.
Well, Israel Folau was interesting because Israel Folau quoted basically the Bible, and some people felt, well, that was a bit harsh. He didn't build it's sort of throwing stuff from the Bible out there, maybe without context and stuff. Okay, and maybe there's a backlash, but not what happened to him. That was ridiculous. But Andrew Thorburn hasn't even done that. In fact, not many people know who are listening, but the NAB Pride Round came out in AFL football when he was head of the NAB Bank, and he was the one who was very supportive in putting that forward, and obviously he didn't agree with that lifestyle, but he felt we need to be inclusive, and we'll have a round that recognised that. Well, that was his, but no, that's never come out with people who've criticised him.
I have heard that, and I don't know this for sure, but I've heard that legally Muslims are protected and Jews are protected, but Christians are not in the Bill of Rights. So I will come back to the legal issue in a moment, but I understand that is the case, and so that's why the whole religious protection laws.
Well, that's what this article was coming from. We read Freedom of Faith. It's a compelling need for a federal religious discrimination act, which should have gone through a few years ago.
Last year when I was in Canberra, it actually was defeated. Earlier this year, I should say, that was happening. And so the mood up there, I was actually up there for the Freedom Rally.
Right.
And that was being debated at that moment. And the atmosphere, which of course the media didn't really give the truth about, I mean, between the two Parliament houses, it was actually chock full of people. And there were so many Australians that are really concerned, and there was a lot of Christians there. We were there praying and worshipping, and there was a tent reading the Bible, and there was evangelism and all sorts of stuff happening. But that was happening there. Bruce, you've got this book that's a really helpful indicator to you.
Yeah, I don't know this person personally, but in a discussion where Australian Christian churches, we had to be addressed as to how we handle or will handle the Act, which is in Victoria, which basically doesn't allow ministers to pray for someone who wants to transition back. Like, let's say they've got homosexual tendencies and they come to a minister and say, could you pray for me because I want to live a heterosexual life as I seem to be indicated in Scripture. And if I was to, or you or any minister was to pray for them and that got back to some activists, well, the law basically says it's the first law that's bans a form of prayer. So in our society, that's what's happening in Victoria. So as this was being shared by a lawyer who was explaining to pastors how to maintain credibility and to be truthful to the Word of God, but not get trapped because people will call up and ask, oh, Pastor Bruce, could you pray for me? I've got this, and we want to be gracious, pray for people, but it's someone who's set you up.
Yeah.
So it's a very challenging time, I often say now, and I was senior pastor at Victory Church, as you know, for many years, and it was not as difficult as it is now for some of the senior pastors who are pastoring now, because the law's a whole lot different. And as we said, we've gone from postmodern to a post-Christian moralistic society who's making up their own morals based on a non-Christian
worldview. Them every day.
Yeah. So the name of the book by Stephen McAlpine, it's an Aussie, Western Australian. I think he's a pastor, but Stephen McAlpine is called Being the Good Guys. With on the front of the book, it's got bad over good. In other words, how to live for Jesus in a world that says you shouldn't. And I really just encourage you. John Anderson, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, has recommended it. He says this: have you noticed that recently Christian views aren't seen as merely false but dangerous? That's because things have changed. Our opinions no longer are worth considering, but rather in need of silencing. How did this happen? How did Christians become the bad guys? In this illuminating tour through the modern Western world, discover why our culture has such a problem with Christian ethics and learn how to avoid surprise and anger and instead remain calm. This is really important, confident and clear-sighted. This book isn't about how to stop being the bad guys. It's about to be the best bad guy you can be. In other words, one of the things that highlights in this book by Stephen McAlpine, you can get it through Koorong. I heard the article by the lawyer and quickly ordered, came in a couple of days. But this is something I think is really important in the answer. He says this in the book. I'll just quickly quote this, Ruth. It says, and the way we live must be shocking in a way that's also compelling. It must raise questions for those looking on. Such questions as, if our way of thinking as Christians about sexuality and individual expression is so wrong, how come their lives look so good? Or if they're supposedly given over to hate speech, how come they serve and love their enemies? Or why is their speech so measured when they're scorned on social media? Or most perturbingly to a culture that views personal sexual freedom as our primary identity marker, why are their marriages strong, their single people chaste, and their same-sex attracted people so fulfilled by non-sexual relationships? So in other words, saying live the Christian life at the highest level we can as an example to say, well, I don't know what you're saying, this is the best life to live.
Yes, exactly. Yes, a real demonstration. Well, I'm talking with Bruce Claridge, who's a sports chaplain, and we're talking about this very difficult issue that's in society at the moment. We're going to listen to Paul Wilbur. The battle is yours, because it really is the Lord's battle, and we'll talk more in a moment. I'm talking with Bruce Claridge today, and we're talking about the issue with Andrew Thorburn. I must say my first response on hearing the Essendon Football Club decision was, is this our moment the Christians are being thrown into the lion's den? And it was interesting, a few days later I saw a meme where it said the Essendon Football Club was the new Colosseum. And I was like, not to pick on them, but I mean, and some have said this is low-level persecution. Now, I've done a lot of work, as you know, in Israel and the Middle East, and compared to that, it's very low level. But but we know the intolerance towards Christians and Jews is rising. Open Doors last year, and I'm just quoting from Open Doors report, Over 360 million Christians live in a place of high-level persecution and discrimination. 360 million. Now listen to this one. 6,000 Christians were killed for their faith in 2021. That's, if my maths is right, about 16 a day. Around 5,000 churches and Christian buildings are attacked, and around 5,000 believers detained without trial, arrested, sentenced, or imprisoned. It is considered that Christians are persecuted as much now as during the early church. Yet in places like Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, the church is growing rapidly, in fact, the fastest growing churches. And so this is a challenge to us in our faith. The interesting thing is that Marxism has targeted Christianity first as a means to erode society, because Christianity is the first target, because faith is the hardest obstacle for Marxism to erode. So they work on a 40-year plan to drip by drip erosion, which they've done in the West. And so it's now obviously, suddenly we faced a level of resistance not experienced before. As we said before, we grew up when Christianity was respected. Everyone went to church, but it says in the scripture, everything will be shaken that can be shaken. And it's really a time of separating between passive believers and those who are totally committed. And, as we were just talking about, really challenging our faith that we've known and believed and held and loved. But it's making us go that deeper and ask questions, am I prepared to be persecuted for my faith?
I think that's really accurate, Ruth. And we sometimes forget that it says in 2 Timothy 3 that in the last days people will become... There's a whole list of things which almost read like our society.
Yes.
And to quote from the book that I've been speaking about, a person, Sayers, said this. He says, our progressive culture seeks a kingdom without the king. Now, the ambition to replace the kingdom vision of the good life, a future world of human rights, dignity, freedom, love and equality, but all without Jesus at the centre. And frustratingly, for those among us who may wish to see the whole thing come crashing down in order to prove how right we are, this vision appears to be progressing quite well, at least on the surface. Equality, diversity programs now par for the course, large corporations, freedom for sexual minorities is celebrated by secularists everywhere. Emancipation for every marginalised group is showcased across social media. Meanwhile, the church is presented as, this is a good word, curmudgeonly, grumpy, and downright angry, which is no longer running the Freedom and Joy program. And I think that's what's being tried to be conveyed in this post-Christian culture, is you don't need the church. It stops you from worshipping self.
Yes.
And this is the key. People have decided most things we look at on TV ads are concerned about you being a better self, a better person. This will help you. You will do this. And we even had former Christian leaders. One, I won't mention my name, but spoke in Melbourne last night. And I had a person close to me go and listen to him and basically said the whole thing is shifting. He was a strong Christian leader, has shifted to more a Buddhist, self-progressing, almost reason to no longer believe. And what's happening, deconstructing the faith. Deconstructing the faith to suit me. So, in other words, in this way of doing things, I look for a faith that suits Bruce Claridge, not a faith based on the sacrificial life and love that he has for me of Jesus Christ. And that's where society's headed, and people are applauding that. And virtue signalling is everywhere. And coming back to sport, the recent virtue signalling by our netball girls has cost them a lot in netball, $15 million from Gina Reinhardt. But also, many times, sports people are speaking up. And I love, as you know, I love cricket. You too, Ruth. We a lot to do together with cricket. Even Australian captain, Pat Cummins, virtue signaling, you've got to be, it's like the Pharisees. You've got to have everything spot on or you'll miss something. And he was standing in front of a what was it, Longi, which is a company out of China that persecutes the
Uyghurs.
The Uyghurs, the Muslim minority, and has them almost as slave labour, yet stood in front of that.
The hypocrisy.
Yes, so the hypocrisy bit is starting to be revealed and will unravel. And I believe it's an exciting time to be the real church, not the grumpy church or the religious church, but the real church with joy and purpose and life
Amen.
and vitality that is there in many churches.
Yeah. Which takes us back to the early church, which was highly persecuted, thrown to the lions, but yet really effective because they were fed income in that sense.
Right.
And we've I think we've been challenged. And you were saying about this other minister, I heard another one yesterday, somebody that been involved in deliverance ministry and whatnot, and they're changing, and the Pope recently has affirmed officially Chrislam. So the synchronism between Islam and Christianity and everything being watered down. So we are really in a very deep time. I just want to change the conversation slightly. It's a shock to us, though, because of where we've been and comfortable. And the idea of persecution is not something we like the idea of. But I think sometimes it's because our sense of who God is has been warped in our sense of what success is. And I went into the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, and it actually starts off about how we see God. And it's important also with Romans 1, which talks about they exchanged the truth of God for the lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And he gave them up to the vile passions. But it also speaks about how we see God. And so in Hebrews 1, it says, faith empowers us to see that the universe was created and coordinated by the power of God's word. And then it lists Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Samuel, David, and so on. And what's really interesting, and it says, through faith's power, they conquered kingdoms and established true justice. Their faith fastened onto their promises and pulled them into reality. Their weakness, their faith imparted power to make them strong. Faith sparked courage within them, that they could be mighty warriors to pull armies from another realm into battle array. But it also gave them to endure great atrocities. And what's interesting with Abel's the first one that's mentioned, and of course he was murdered because he gave a good sacrifice by his brother. And so that's you look through the list and it says all these wonderful things, and we have tended to think that's success. But now we're going, no, and in that list there's all these others, and I love the way it finishes off, and it says, some of these faith champions were brutally killed. They lost everything they possessed, endured great afflictions, cruelly mistreated. Truly the world was not even worthy of them, not realising who they were.
I think, Ruth, you've really hit on something. Our definition of success in the Christian faith, and you and I have lived through many different Christian faith definitions, whether it be mega church, whether it be great worship, whether it be great preaching, and all of these things are good. Fine, I love the fact that healthy things grow. But it's similar to what you just read there in 1 Peter verses chapter 1, 6 and 7. He says, you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith may result in praise, glory, and honour when Jesus Christ is revealed. So the suffering that his readers are experiencing isn't punishment for sin, but rather the purifying process that all of God's people undergo. The struggles, even what we're experiencing as the culture turns against us, are an opportunity for God to refine us, and we've spoken earlier both individually and as a church, in order to bring glory to God through our joyful obedience in the midst of suffering. And I think the church has opportunity to be the church and not just be a religious gathering of people who hear a nice message on Sunday, go away, live their life, come back, hear another nice message. But we're to turn the world upside down. And I think you spoke about the early church, and one of the things that's always hit me hard over the COVID period was we had Christians hiding away from coming together and locking themselves away. And some had good reason, who had immunological problems. But I hearken back to the story which turned around, if you like, the Roman community to when the massive plague of Rome. Now, COVID looked like a sniffly nose compared to the plague that hit Rome. When all the Roman soldiers would come back from fighting wars and bring with them this plague. And thousands were dying. And what the church had been persecuted to that point did, they saw Christians at the risk, and many of them losing their own lives, being the only ones who went into these dying rooms and spent time with people at the risk of getting the plague, and many did themselves and dying. And the whole attitude to the church, in the early church, changed. They said, these guys are for real. They don't value their life if they can serve others. They're living for this God called Jesus, and suddenly, well, maybe not suddenly, but it all started to get a fresh picture of the church and the persecution lifted. Maybe it's a chance for the church to be the church, to live the best lives we can live, and draw people to Christ when the world is going, and it's starting to unravel for the world. We've got different sects who are working against one another now, who did, work together. And just as an example, we have lesbians not happy with trans people because of some of the things they're saying. So it's almost unraveling, and I believe it will. But we have to not get caught in, because I've seen some Christians get caught in fighting the wrong fight, particularly during COVID, and have now lost their reason for living because that consumed them. They got angry and they got bitter and they've missed out. So we have to be the church and be the best church, be the most joyful, and yes, walk through this time of perhaps reality, because to be honest, we haven't really had persecution. The church has been, it's a nice place to go to, or good you do that, postmodernism. Now it's changing. It is. And it is a refining, I think, too.
It is, absolutely. And it's interesting because where I was then heading to was Hebrews 12, which is the basis of the next song we're going to listen to, for the joy set before us. It says in verse 2, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in yourselves. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. And so this call is for us to really get back to basics, to the cross, and to know that the cross is before us, that the joy set before him was the cross and what that would accomplish. Karen Davis singing, for the joy set before him. Praise the Lord, our eyes see the King, and then we can stand in these days. These issues of religious freedom, freedom of speech, they affect us all. Family relationships, parents, school children, people's jobs, social interactions, church relationships, and immense pressure on those in business and church leadership, and as we've been talking about in sport, and of course the issue of religious persecution, which we've just talked about. I'm going to talk about, first of all, so there's 4 things I want to quickly talk about now. The first one is, what about when these issues impact your family? The issues of same-sex marriage, gender dysphoria, abortion, euthanasia become extremely gut-wrenching when they're close to home, especially for Christians holding to the word. We have personally had to face some of these issues, and it's extremely challenging to maintain a relationship with family members while remaining faithful to the Lord. When we had an invitation to a same-sex wedding with extended family, we declined on the basis of our convictions. However, when it came to a tragic death within that household, we did not hesitate to attend the funeral to support and express love to the family. Though it was challenging for us, they deeply appreciated our attendance. Now, your response may be different to ours, but we each need to work through these difficult matters before the Lord. We need to know his word, his heart, and his direction.
Yeah, Ruth, that's very powerful and obviously a very emotional time. I think one of the things that Christians are always endeavouring to do, and obviously that's what you had to walk through, is the balance of grace and truth. And this grace-truth balance has to be something we're always wrestling with, thus the need for prayer, thus the need for knowing the word. And I think that's so important that we know the word, not just parts of the word. And so we have to balance grace and truth, and in a particular family situation, might need something a little bit different, but the Holy Spirit will speak individually, personally, as we really get before God and seek to balance grace and truth.
Yes, that's good. I always think of the aeroplane with 2 wings.
That's right,
in terms of truth and love, and without one wing, you're in trouble.
Exactly.
And so that's really important. So the second issue is, going back to the Andrew Thorburn issue, is the freedom of association. the idea of losing your job because of who you associate with. Dan Flynn of the Australian Christian Lobby said this is a critical issue for church leaders, but it also affects every church member. The traditional view, which we've talked about, of marriage and abortion are mainstream views of Christians. And he said that it's concerning that these mainstay views are being challenged in this way. Any employer could target any church-going employee. The risk for anyone going to church, especially if the workplace has inclusion and diversity policy. But if we don't fight for it, it will be lost. The Australian Christian Lobby is now being designated as a hate group by a US Southern Poverty Law Centre, a left-wing extremist group saying Christians are the problem because they're trying to shame pro-life and pro-family.
I think it's interesting, the Freedom from Faith statement concludes with a call on the Australian government to fulfil a promise made a long time ago, to bring out a federal religious discrimination bill as a matter of urgency, and to do this in such a way as to protect all Australian citizens from the kinds of religious discrimination, vilification, coercion, even by association that you're speaking about, such that Andrew Thorburn experienced. I think Andrew Thorburn has shown incredible grace. I have not heard from, apart from his initial statement of the injustice, but he stood by grace, and God will honour that man. And it's interesting, Ruth, when I knew the name somewhere, I did helped with some training of sports chaplains during Zoom and there were about 20 faces on the Zoom call. And I thought, I know, and I recognised when it came later, Andrew Thorburn had done that course to be a sports chaplain. He hadn't had time in all the process of things to outwork it, but and he's a very well-respected, very honoured person in the role he has, and also wanted to be a sports chaplain. So this call for religious discrimination bill is so important.
That then takes us on to the legalities. So the question then was asked, where does Essendon sit legally? It's a question for all workers. Dan Flynn, again of the Australian Christian Lobby, says under Equal Opportunity Act, employers cannot discriminate against on the basis of religion. And he suggested that Andrew Thorburn would have a course of action. But he also asked if the Premier, after he made his appalling comments, should be removed. But Professor Augusto Zimmerman, who was the Law Reform Commissioner in Western Australia from 2012 to 2017, he recently wrote an article for The Spectator Australia, and he considered the situation in the light of the Victorian Racial and Religious Intolerance Act, passed by a Labor government in 2001. And he then cited Premier Daniel Andrews' comment about the Andrew Thorburn case. And he then finished with this question. He said, has Premier Andrews breached the Victorian Racial and Religious Intolerance Act? Now, they are good questions that would need to be tested in court, but that goes to what you just said about the need for religious protection legally.
And also, when we come to, one thing that really concerns me, Ruth, at times, when we come to elections, when we're coming up to a state election, I don't want to be political, but I do want to challenge Christians to fully understand what's going on in a particular party, whatever it might be that they're voting for, or independent person, to know a little bit more about, to look what will be best for the body of Christ, what will be best for Christians as to how I vote. Not I've always voted Liberal, I've always voted Labor, I've always voted whatever, but to say, okay, has this party that I once voted for, has it changed? Is it the same as I... And find out what's going on, pray, and then look at voting, I think is recommended by some Christian organisations. Pray for the person, not the party.
Exactly.
Find who is going to bring Christian influence into our government.
I know with the federal election, we put out an issue of 10 questions, which I sent to candidates. And that was really helpful, and it was based on all of those things. And that's another story, because we ended up with some very interesting things there. Now, I want to go to the fourth one about migration. Now, I hadn't thought about this, but I was listening to an interview Peter Credlin did the other night, and she interviewed Dan Tehan, who's the Shadow Immigration Minister. And just after he had spoken at the Press Club on the 18th of October in Canberra, and he addressed the link between migration and religious freedom. So here we go again. And he said, migrants come to this country because they will be safe and we will protect them. He said the Thorburn case made him think more deeply about freedom of religion. And he said, we have to protect against religious discrimination. He said 55% of Australians have a religious affiliation. 70% of migrants have a religious affiliation. When we undermine religious freedom and freedom of speech, presumption of innocence, we undermine our ability to attract the best migrants. He called on the governments to put legislation forward. He said, cancel culture continues to march towards our institutions. We need to draw a line in the sand and be prepared to stand up and say, enough is enough. And then a day or so later, I heard an interview with a man who's a migrant from Bosnia. And he came to Australia as a refugee. He's now thinking about returning to Bosnia because of the loss of freedoms in Melbourne. And he said, this is, I quote, Bosnia now has more freedoms than Australia. I mean, and he said, if we speak up, we'll be harassed. There's so much fear, especially from the lockdowns. So here's this man from Bosnia saying that has more freedoms than Australia.
It's interesting, isn't it? We often have, we had changes, we've had things happen, and people have got to understand we have to be prepared to speak out. Be prepared to follow the word and do it with grace. And I've seen some Christian political activists forget the grace side and be really angry and aggressive. And I think what we need to ensure is we're hearing from God, where our speech is full of grace, seasoned with salt. And if the salt starts to go out, it says it loses its flavour. And because what's actually happening is eventually, it's like the bully in the playground. They'll take this away. I'll take this away and let you have that. I'll take this away until eventually, if we don't watch out, we'll have a church just sitting in a little corner singing Kumbaya and just being all nice to one another. And the sad bit is some people think that's a nice way to live. But we're called to turn the world upside down.
Yes, that's right.
You know? I think Ruth will be pleased with this. I have a text come through. It's from your friend. And from my wife. She says, loving the fact neither of you have to be politically correct. You're both able to say what you believe. So that's good.
That's
anyway,
good.
I thought I'd toss that in, Ruth. So
but
someone's listening.
That's good. But it's interesting that migrants are really feeling the pressure in this. And it was something I hadn't even thought about. And obviously, even the shadow immigration minister hadn't either. That this issue in sport is now hitting people that have migrated here. They've come here because they're safe. We know lots of migrants, and as I say, we've worked in the Middle East, and in the prayer world, we do a lot of work in that space. And so, for migrants to feel unsafe now here in Australia, this whole issue goes way beyond sport.
It does. That's right. It's into whole freedom of expression, of faith, and all the things that our nation's been modelled on. You know. And we have been a nation that people want to come to. And that Bosnian example of you is a very sad one. I smile because it was just so out there that someone would choose to go back to a nation that's had civil wars and all the different governments that have been brutal.
Europe is right now.
Yeah, that's right. And here saying that I'd rather be there than... And this subtle persecution, which some people who've been through genuine deep persecution are starting to see. Maybe we're not at times. We think it'll all be the same. But we've experienced as the church over the last 100 years or so in Australia, quite a lot of freedom. And we're not used to things changing. Correct. But they are very quickly.
Very quickly. So we're going to listen to Paul Wilbur now singing Who Is Like Thee? There's no one like the Lord who gives us strength in these days. The Song of Moses is a powerful song of reminding who the Lord is. I've been talking today with Bruce Claridge, who's a sports chaplain, and it's a very important discussion that we've been having today. These are very issues that challenge us all as Christians. And I just want to finish off today with from Romans chapter 1, where it talks about these issues actually, about the Lord actually lifted his restraining hand to give mankind full expression of these sinful and shameful desires, given over to moral depravity, dishonouring their bodies by sexual perversion, because they traded the truth of God for a lie. They worshipped and served the things God made rather than the God who made all things. glory and praises to him for eternity of eternities. For this reason, God gave them over to their own passions. But the chapter finishes with a very sobering verse. And it says, in verse 32, although they are fully aware of God's laws and proper order, because earlier in the chapter it says, "O man, you are without excuse, you know who God has made himself clear. His fingerprints are all over history through creation. He's made it very clear who he is. O man, you are without excuse." So it finishes the chapter and says, although they are fully aware of God's laws and proper order, and knowing that those who do all these things deserve the punishment, yet they still go headlong into darkness. Well, this is the part that's really challenging to us. Encouraging others to do the same and applaud those who do them. In other words, praising and giving confirmation to those that are trampling on the word of the Lord. And so that's the challenge for us today as Christians. So I trust that today has been a help to you to think through these issues. Go to the word, go to the cross, because at the end of the day, our faith is based on what Jesus accomplished at the cross and in his resurrection. And without that, we are of all men most miserable. God bless you.